Keanu Reeves was known around the world as a movie star, the Keanu Reeves. From The Matrix to John Wick, he had built a reputation as one of Hollywood's most loved actors. But even the most humble hearts can forget their roots when fame and fortune pile up. On this day, for the first time in a long time, Keanu let his success get to his head. It was a clear, sunny afternoon in Los Angeles when Keanu arrived at the airport. He stepped out of a sleek black car, wearing a crisp designer suit, shiny Italian leather shoes, and a watch that cost more than some people's cars. His assistant hurried behind him with a perfectly packed leather bag. All eyes were on him, just the way he liked it today. Inside the terminal, people whispered and stared. Some took photos from a distance, too shy to ask for a selfie. Keanu didn't mind. He offered a half-smile here and there, but kept his sunglasses on, even inside, like a shield between himself and the world. He liked the distance. It reminded everyone who he was, a superstar. At the gate, the flight attendants greeted him with starstruck grins and polite nods. He nodded back coolly, barely meeting their eyes. As he walked down the jet bridge, he moved slowly, savoring the moment. For him, this wasn't just a flight. It was a reminder that he'd made it to the top. He stepped onto the plane and paused in the first-class cabin, scanning it like a king inspecting his palace. The luxurious leather seats, the quiet hum of polite conversation, the glasses of champagne already sparkling on tray tables. This was his comfort zone. Keanu carefully placed his expensive bag in the overhead bin, adjusted his suit jacket, and settled into his seat like he owned it. He took off his sunglasses just long enough to check his reflection in his phone, then slipped them back on. First class was where he could stretch out, sip fine wine, and enjoy subtle nods from people too shy to disturb him, just how he liked it. But then, something interrupted his perfect bubble. A man boarded late. A man who looked completely out of place among the quiet luxury. He wore faded jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and old sneakers. His hair was messy, and he looked like he'd come straight from a long road trip, not the VIP lounge. He had no fancy suitcase, just a worn-out backpack he tucked under his arm. Keanu watched as the man checked his boarding pass, looked down the aisle, and realized he was sitting right next to Keanu himself. The man stopped, gave Keanu a warm, polite smile, and said softly, "Hey there," nodding in greeting as if he were meeting an old friend. Keanu looked him up and down behind his dark glasses. He leaned back, then forward, making sure his voice carried just enough of the rows ahead to hear. With a smirk curling at the edge of his lips, he said, "Don't they have dress codes for first class now?" A couple sitting nearby exchanged awkward glances. A young woman reading a book shifted in her seat uncomfortably. But the scruffy man just gave a small, polite smile, like he didn't hear the insult at all. He sat down, pulled his backpack under the seat, and folded his hands calmly on his lap. Keanu smirked behind his glasses, thinking he'd just reminded this nobody where he belonged, far away from stars like him. But what Keanu didn't know was that life has a funny way of humbling even the biggest stars, and the lesson waiting for him at 30,000 feet was about to make him rethink everything he thought he knew about true class. The flight took off smoothly, lifting high above the clouds as the city lights of Los Angeles faded far below. Keanu sank deeper into his plush first-class seat, swirling the champagne in his glass like it was a trophy. He felt untouchable up here, famous, rich, admired. The stranger next to him, Steven Spielberg, noticed the shift in the mood too, but stayed calm, eyes twinkling with a secret only he and the rest of first class seemed to share. Just then, one of the flight attendants, Sarah, the one who had been peeking down the aisle every chance she got, finally couldn't help herself. She approached their row, tray in hand, her face beaming with the kind of joy you see when someone meets their hero by surprise. "Excuse me, Mr. Spielberg," she said softly, careful not to draw too much attention, but it was too late for that. Every ear nearby perked up at that one name, Spielberg. Keanu nearly dropped his glass. He turned his head so fast that his sunglasses slipped halfway down his nose. "Wait, Mr. Spielberg?" he repeated, as if he hadn't heard her correctly. Sarah nodded with an excited smile and turned back to the director. "Would you like another drink, sir? Or anything special?" It's truly an honor to have you on board with us today." Keanu stared at Spielberg's calm face. The same face he'd just been mocking for dressing cheaply. The same man he'd assumed was an extra, a luggage handler, or someone's assistant. Stephen looked at Keanu and chuckled kindly. "No, thank you, Sarah. I'm perfectly fine," he said. Then he turned to Keanu, his tone gentle but the twinkle in his eyes impossible to miss. "You look like you could use another glass, though." Keanu's mouth opened, but no words came out. His cheeks flushed pink under his sunglasses. He pushed them up onto his head, as if seeing the world clearly now for the first time in hours. He glanced around the cabin. People were definitely watching. A couple of passengers quickly looked away to hide their smiles. The young boy across the aisle gave Keanu an innocent thumbs up that made him shrink even more into his seat. In that moment, every single boast about big movies, box office numbers, and directors begging to work with him came crashing down like a badly written movie ending. He'd spent the entire flight bragging about his importance to a man who had literally created the industry's greatest blockbusters. A man with more Oscars than Keanu had houses. The worst part? Spielberg hadn't rubbed it in his face once. He hadn't bragged. He hadn't shut him down. He hadn't needed to. His name alone did it for him, louder than any fancy speech ever could. Keanu's mind raced. Should he apologize? Crack a joke? Pretend he'd known all along? But no excuse would fix how small he suddenly felt in his perfectly tailored suit. Sarah, trying to keep it light, poured Keanu a fresh glass of champagne anyway. She shot him a polite, almost pitying smile, then turned back to Spielberg with the kind of respect Keanu had been trying and failing to demand all flight long. Passengers settled back, whispering about the scene they'd just witnessed. Some smiled at Spielberg, who just nodded and thanked the flight attendant as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Keanu, meanwhile, sank deeper in his seat, hoping the rest of the flight would pass quickly, and that maybe, just maybe, people would forget what they'd seen. But there was no forgetting a lesson like this one. Not for him. Not for anyone watching. For the rest of the flight, Keanu sat frozen in his wide leather seat, trying to melt into it like a child hiding from trouble. The sparkle of his designer watch felt dull now, the gold cufflinks suddenly meaningless. He kept glancing sideways at Steven Spielberg, hoping maybe the legendary director would break the tension with a kind word, or at least give him a way out of the embarrassment. But Spielberg didn't gloat. He didn't lecture or mock him back. Instead, he did what he always did best. He made people feel comfortable. He turned to chat with the flight attendants, asking them about their day, their families, their favorite movies. He thanked them warmly for their service, making sure to use their names each time. When a young couple shyly asked for an autograph, Spielberg took the time to sign not just their napkin, but to ask their names too, wishing them a wonderful trip. When a nervous older man struggled to pull down his bag from the overhead bin mid-flight, Spielberg stood up and helped him without a second thought. Meanwhile, Keanu sat back, watching in silence as the man he'd insulted did everything he himself hadn't done, show humility, kindness, and quiet respect to everyone around him. At one point, Spielberg even turned back to Keanu and said, "You know, I've always admired your work, Keanu. You've done some great films." His tone was genuine, not sarcastic, not mocking, not bitter. Just honest praise from a giant to a man who'd momentarily forgotten what true greatness looks like. Keanu's cheeks burned. He could barely meet Spielberg's eyes. He mumbled a thank you, but the words felt tiny compared to his loud bragging from just hours before. When the captain finally announced their descent into New York, the cabin came alive with the usual rustle of seatbelts clicking and overhead bins opening. Keanu sat still for a moment, then slowly turned to Spielberg. He took off his sunglasses completely this time, looking him in the eye. I owe you an apology, Mr. Spielberg," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all flight. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have spoken the way I did." Spielberg just smiled, patting his arm gently. "It's all right, Keanu. We all get carried away sometimes. Just remember, people notice how you treat others. That's what they really remember when the credits roll." Those words hit Keanu harder than any insult could have. It wasn't anger or revenge. It was simple truth from a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. When the plane landed, passengers took selfies with Spielberg, who never once acted annoyed or rushed. He thanked the crew, waved at the boy across the aisle who had recognized him first, and stepped off the plane with his small backpack slung over one shoulder, the same way he'd boarded, humble and unassuming. Keanu followed behind, clutching his fancy bag, feeling every step of the walk of shame through the jet bridge. He knew everyone would talk about this flight, but maybe that was a good thing. Maybe he needed this lesson, a reminder that no amount of fame, money, or luxury could buy real respect. As he stepped out into the busy New York terminal, Keanu Reeves, the famous movie star who had forgotten his roots for a moment, promised himself he'd never forget them again. And for everyone who watched it happen, it was a story they'd never forget either. Proof that true greatness never needs to shout. It only needs to show up, smile kindly, and let its work speak for itself. Next to him, the quiet man in jeans sat calmly, looking out the window for a moment before folding his hands in his lap. He seemed perfectly content, which almost annoyed Keanu. How could someone dressed like that be so relaxed sitting in a seat that cost more than most people's rent for a month? Keanu, feeling bolder with every sip of expensive champagne, decided he wanted to remind this stranger exactly where he stood, or where he thought he should stand. He leaned over, gave a smug half-smile, and asked in a tone dripping with fake curiosity, "So what do you do? Or did you just win the lottery to get this seat?" A few passengers in nearby rows looked over, sensing that Keanu's smooth Hollywood charm was hiding something meaner underneath. The man beside him didn't flinch. He just turned, met Keanu's eyes calmly, and said with a light chuckle, "I work in the film industry." His voice was warm, friendly, and so relaxed that it almost threw Keanu off. Keanu's eyebrows shot up behind his dark sunglasses. He set down his glass with a soft clink and let out a mocking little laugh. "Film industry? Really? Were you an actor? Or maybe you hold a camera? Or you run around with a clipboard and coffee for the real stars?" He leaned back, stretching out his legs, clearly enjoying himself. He wanted the nearby passengers to hear. He wanted them to see that he was the important one here. The man laughed again, the same calm, polite laugh. "Something like that," he said simply, still not giving away any details. Keanu frowned for a second, annoyed that his seatmate wasn't taking the bait. But he quickly recovered, ready to fill the silence with the thing he loved most at that moment, himself. So he started talking, loud enough for people nearby to hear every word, but pretending it was just casual conversation. He spoke about his blockbuster films, the red carpets, the roaring crowds, the award shows where people lined up just for a photo with him. He bragged about his mansions in the Hollywood Hills, his vacation homes overseas, his custom motorcycles, and the luxury cars waiting in his garage. He described private parties where billionaires and other stars toasted him like he was royalty. Every so often, he would pause to sip his champagne, glance sideways to see if the man looked jealous. But the man just listened, nodding politely now and then, never interrupting, never trying to top Keanu's stories with any stories of his own. That polite silence made Keanu feel even bigger. He mistook kindness for weakness, humility for a lack of success. He had no clue that the man next to him had probably seen more, done more, and shaped the very movies he bragged about. The other passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to each other as Keanu's voice carried on about himself, filling the cabin with empty ego. They watched the man beside him nod, smile, and sit calmly, as if he had all the time in the world, because in truth he did. Little did Keanu know, every word he bragged about was about to make his regret even heavier when the truth finally came out. As Keanu kept boasting about his lavish lifestyle and blockbuster hits, the atmosphere in first class began to shift. While he droned on about celebrity parties and luxury cars, the quiet man beside him sat still, never correcting him, never interrupting. Passengers who had been reading magazines or watching movies started glancing over more often. Some pretended to stretch or adjust their seatbelts just so they could sneak another look at the calm stranger sitting beside the loud superstar. That's when a young boy sitting across the aisle finally tugged at his mother's sleeve. He'd been staring for the last 10 minutes, squinting, trying to be sure. "Mom, that's Steven Spielberg," he whispered in an excited but careful voice. His mother blinked, lowered her book, and looked across the aisle. When she saw the man's warm, familiar face, that gentle smile, that unmistakable look she'd seen in countless behind-the-scenes interviews, her eyes widened. She leaned in and whispered to her husband, who peeked over his glasses and nearly dropped his drink. Within minutes, it was like a ripple of realization moved through the front rows of first class. A teenage girl with earbuds and looked up from her phone, stared, then quickly pulled out her phone to check Google Images, just to be sure she wasn't imagining things. Yes, it was him, Steven Spielberg, the man behind Jurassic Park, E.T., Indiana Jones, Jaws, Saving Private Ryan, and dozens of other films that changed cinema forever. The quiet man in the plain t-shirt and jeans wasn't a random passenger. He was a living legend, a master storyteller worth far more than any of the loud boasts Keanu was making about himself. A young couple a few rows back whispered to each other. The husband held up his phone, showing Spielberg's photo. The wife's eyes widened. "Is Keanu bragging to Steven Spielberg?" she whispered back, trying not to laugh. Meanwhile, two flight attendants near the galley peeked down the aisle, then exchanged wide-eyed smiles. One of them, a huge movie buff, nudged her co-worker and giggled. "That's Spielberg, sitting next to Keanu Reeves. And Keanu's acting like he's the king of Hollywood." It was painfully obvious to everyone else how backwards this scene was. A man who had starred in big movies bragging endlessly to the man who had made big movies possible for generations. It would have been funny if it weren't so painfully awkward. But the only person who seemed completely unaware was Keanu himself. He leaned back, swirling his fresh glass of champagne, talking about box office numbers and how directors fight to work with him. He had no clue he was talking about his own bragging to the very person who probably gave those directors their first big break. The quiet legend beside him didn't look annoyed, though. He just sat calmly, offering a small nod or polite laugh now and then. He didn't correct Keanu, didn't interrupt him to drop his own name, didn't brag back about his awards or his legacy. If anything, Spielberg seemed amused, like a father listening to a child boast about catching a big fish while standing on the deck of his yacht. Every few minutes, more passengers caught on. Some pretended to take selfies, but angled their cameras just right to catch Spielberg in the background. Others simply watched the drama unfold, half embarrassed for Keanu, half fascinated by how unaware he was. If Keanu had taken off his sunglasses and really looked around, he might have seen the knowing smiles and the phone's sneaking photos. He might have heard the whispers and realized that all eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on the quiet man who didn't need to show off to be the most important person in the cabin. But Keanu just kept talking, blind to the lesson that was about to land right in his lap. A lesson that no first-class ticket, no red carpet, and no shiny watch could buy. Keanu finally paused long enough to take another slow sip of champagne. He leaned his head back and glanced around, expecting to see people admiring him, listening closely to his tales of fame and luxury. But instead, he caught something he didn't like. Passengers whispering, side-eyeing, and hiding smirks behind napkins and magazines. His ego flickered for a moment. Was there something on his face? Did he spill his drink? He tugged at the sleeve of his designer suit, trying to brush away an invisible speck of lint.